woodland is really starting to look quite wintry. We don't get fabulous colour this far west that you get elsewhere in England and the UK. I think that's mainly because we just don't get as much cold weather. Down here in the far west of Cornwall, we very rarely get frost, which means that our leaves tend to turn from green to brown, and then we have a strong coastal wind and all of the leaves drop to the ground. I was recently in Hampshire and was just blown away by how beautiful the autumn colour was. I think the combination of the variety of trees that are there that we don't necessarily get in Cornwall, but also the fact that it gets a bit colder means that the change of colour happens, and then the strong winds aren't as strong as they are in Cornwall. So the leaves tend to last on the trees for a bit longer. But I would really love to have some more autumnal colour in the garden, and the only way I think I'm going to achieve that is by planting varieties that will specifically give me that fabulous autumn colour that I'm looking for. So over the last couple of years I've been planting some trees like Acer and Liriodendron, which will give me those fiery reds and golds that I won't necessarily get from the trees that we have here naturally within our woodland. But what I really want to show you today is what the cut flower garden is looking like in November. And there are a few flowers that are still giving us some colour, so I want to share those with you. But I also want to share with you what I'm doing to prepare for the flowers for next year. So welcome back to the cut flower garden. And if you're joining us for the first time, I grow cut flowers and foliage on around about an acre of ground, mainly for weddings. And in this section over here, it is predominantly foliage and grasses. So I've got lots of lovely eucalyptus and viburnum and grasses like miscanthus. And then over on this side, we've got the cut flowers, which is lots of annuals and perennials. And that's what I really want to show you today. So let's go and take a look. So welcome to the cut flower garden in November. We have got 26 flower beds in here, and as you can see, a lot of it is now very brown. I have been pulling things out and mulching, which I will share with you in a moment. But the first thing I want to do is actually show you something that happens every single year in the cut flower garden, and I absolutely love how nature works. Let me show you this. So these are my straw flowers, and I always leave them because they do a very special little thing. They actually start germinating next year's plants whilst they are still growing in the ground. So it's actually on my to-do list for next week is to pull these flower heads off and divide up the seedlings that are coming up within them and pot them on into some compost. They will now give me a lovely early crop starting from around the start of April. So it's really lovely to work with nature in this way. If it wants to grow and produce like these straw flowers are, then I am absolutely all for it. So as we move down the cut flower garden, everything that you can see is generally a perennial. I have left the perennials there specifically for nature to live in over the winter months. So they provide really good habitat for small creatures, insects, and their seeds also are going to be feeding the birds. So these are all remaining here until around February time, but I am mulching around the base, and I mulch with leaves, which I have talked about before. I find that's a really good way of protecting the soil and feeding the soil. And I'm already starting to see the signs of next year's plants coming up here within the cutting garden. So this is the plants that will give us the flowers next year, coming up between this year's flower stems. The herb bed is also doing the same. If I come down here into amongst the lemon balm, you can see next year's stems of lemon balm already starting to bush up from the base. I do still have a little bit of colour though. Can you see those snapdragons down at the end? They are still flowering. They've been flowering since May. They are still flowering now. They've given me so much colour. Snapdragons are a fantastic annual, and I will probably have to pull them out in the next week or so I can mulch around the base there to give the soil a chance to rest. It's worked very hard for me over the last few months, so it's really important that the soil does have a rest and that you feed the soil, feed all the microorganisms that live within the soil, and the best way to do that is to mulch it. But down over here, I've noticed a sure sign of spring flowers from our iris bulbs. Come down and have a look at these. Amongst all the Cocosmia are the irises, which are going to give us some wonderful colour next spring. So there's a couple of jobs that I am yet to do in the cut flower garden, and time is really pressing on. I need to prune my perennial sweet peas because they are going to start re-sprouting soon, and if I don't cut them back, we're not going to have any decent flowers for next year. The other thing I need to do is to prune my roses. This isn't their final winter prune. This is an autumnal prune that I do to prevent wind rock. Because we get so many gale force winds, it is really important to reduce the height of the rose down by about a half, and that's going to stop it catching the wind and rocking the roots, which could potentially lead to the rose dying. It'll then have a proper prune in February, which will encourage lots of new flowers to form for my coming cut flower season. And finally, down at the bottom of the cut flower garden are the dahlia beds, which you can see have been covered with leaves. I have left my dahlias in the ground for the second year now. I've done that because we're on a hillside, so we are very free draining. We also get very little frost, which means that the dahlias really don't rot out in the ground here. But elsewhere in the country, I would probably be very tempted to lift them and store them over winter. But there's one very important place that we have not yet been to, and that is the polytunnel. And that's where I start lots of my early crops, and it's also where I'm overwintering lots of the seedlings for next year. So let's go and take a look. So here we are in the polytunnel, which has been absolutely peppered with leaves. It's going to need a really good wash in the springtime. So as a cut flower grower, the polytunnel is really important because it can give me a protected crop in the springtime, especially when I am trying to grow flowers for weddings. I really need to make sure that those flowers are looking at their absolute best. So up in here, I have my tulip crates, which I planted out a few days ago, and in there are some really beautiful, delicate tulip varieties that you can only get if you grow them yourself. And then here is one of my favourite contraptions. It is my hanging shelf. So this is slug and snail free, and it's also rodent free. So it's a really, really useful thing to have. So some of the plants on this shelf are going to be planted out into the flower beds here in the polytunnel, and some of them are going to be planted out in March in the flower field, but they're just overwintering here on this hanging shelf. So I've got things like Amimagus, corn cockle. I've also got some wild carrot, and there is some saved seed from my hollyhocks, which I collected the seed back in August, and here they are growing up really beautifully. These probably could be put outside to overwinter outside, but for the time being, I'm just growing them on in here in the tunnel. I've also got some Colibri poppies. These are really beautiful, but the seed is really expensive. They're quite slow to grow, so I'm really looking after these ones. And then finally, I've got my first succession of sweet peas. Growing cut flowers is all about successions. Starting things early in the autumn if you can to get an early crop for the following year, and then having another sowing in the springtime, which will give you a later flowering crop. So these were sown in the middle of October, and they're going to start flowering for me really at the start of May, and then I will also sow some more in January, which will start flowering for me around the start of July. So the sweet peas will have 2 successions to keep them flowering all the way through next year. The final thing I want to share with you are my bulb beds, which I predominantly grow daffodils in, and these look fabulous in the springtime. But one thing that does come up in here liberally is nigella, and you can see it behind me. It is a carpet of nigella. Nigella is not allowed in the cut flower garden for this very reason. It is everywhere. I planted it in these beds about 5 years ago, and it is just every year seeding itself all over the place. It's in the paths, it's in the grass, and it's in the beds. I absolutely love nigella, and I do recommend growing it, and the seed pods look fabulous dried, but do harvest them before they start to drop their seeds everywhere. Perhaps grow them in a pot so that you can move the nigella out of the way and it doesn't seed all over your garden and you end up with a mass of it like I do. I think what I've come to realise over the last few years is how incredibly circular gardening is. And by that I mean there just isn't a beginning, a middle and an end to the gardening year. It continues on, and we're already seeing the daffodils reshooting, the herbaceous perennials have already got their leaves starting, which means nothing is ever stationary. Everything is always marching forward, and I think that's why gardening brings such a positive message to so many people, because it's all about hope and new beginnings and fresh starts and the excitement for the future. So I look forward to seeing you next month and seeing what the garden has in store in December. Thanks for being here.